Joining us now to break this all down for us is Shawn Robbins, chief analyst over at Boxoffice Pro. Shawn, good to see you. Good morning. So let's talk about the numbers here for A Quiet Place Part 2. Over the four-day weekend, we're looking maybe about $57 million for this film. That is significant given the fact that the pandemic has really decimated so many films at the box office. So what's your take on this?
Hey Baker, it's great to be back. Yeah, this is a weekend that I think movie fans, movie theaters, studios have been waiting for a long time now. We've seen the film industry have its fits and starts with getting cinema back on its feet during the pandemic, and just a few months ago, this kind of a number was almost unthinkable because we still hadn't really seen the impact of vaccines early in the year. Now we are seeing that, and now we're seeing all sorts of businesses reopen. Theaters have been reopening for quite a while, but we've seen major markets like New York and LA join that parade in the last few months. And studios are committing to these release dates again. So there's just a built-up demand to get back out into daily life, to do everything: movies, concerts, sports. And this is the fruits of, I think, all of the labor of the industry that's been put into this over the past year.
Absolutely. And by the way, if you look at this compared to the first Quiet Place, it's basically still on target with how it was doing in the first one. What do you think is basically the special sauce here as to why A Quiet Place did so well?
Yeah, this was a movie that had actually just been weeks away from release before the shutdown in March of last year. It had been marketed, it had been screened for critics, it was tracking in box office reports on a weekly basis. It was going to open really well. Pre-sales had already begun for tickets. So it had a leg up in some ways. But it's also, I think there's a psychological element to this because the first film was such a breakout hit 3 years ago. And there are some interesting themes that kind of tie into how people have felt during this pandemic with regard to how these characters evolve throughout these movies and to see their story continue. And just on top of the fact that horror films in general are often kind of a barometer for success, even in slow or healthy times for the box office. They're a communal experience. They're meant to be part of that shared theatrical experience, which really made this such a great film to release right now.
Yeah, such a good point. And by the way, the other thing that's interesting, given the fact that HBO Max and even Disney Plus simultaneously would put their films on their streaming service in addition to being in theaters, this is coming in at a different theatrical window here. Essentially, it's going in to the theaters for 45 days, and then Paramount is putting it on their streaming service, Paramount Plus. How big is that going to basically be for the theatrical experience there, given the fact that you don't have streaming competing with it here?
It's major. This is the first theatrically exclusive major tentpole movie to come out since Tenet last year, and this is a very different time, very different circumstances to release this size of a movie that was so anticipated and had so much box office potential. I think we're still going to see an evolution of theatrical windows. We know that the 90-day frames aren't going to come back, but we also know that to some extent those are quite outdated. Theaters don't need most films for 90 days to still be very profitable, and nor do studios. And this opens up a lot of opportunities for perhaps studios to get more movies out into theaters. And with regard to A Quiet Place and all the other films that are coming out that will be exclusive to theaters for roughly that same time frame, it adds that event element back into the release of these movies that really just traditionally isn't there for streaming releases. Not to say that streaming releases can't be successful in their own way at times, but for these kinds of popcorn cinematic, I should say, films designed to be going in movie theaters, this is not only where they're most profitable for the studios, but it's where they're most enjoyed by audiences. So it's really a win-win situation.
Absolutely. And so let's talk, by the way, let's move to Cruella here, because Cruella, second in the box office this week, 4-day weekend total, essentially about $26.5 million. If you basically tie that in with A Quiet Place Part 2, that's $100 million for both of these films at the box office. And Shawn, ComScore is only saying about 70% of theaters are even open right now. What does that sort of tell you about the rest of the summer and the rest of the year? Does that give you the indication that people are hungry to go back to the theaters again?
Absolutely. And we still are talking about less than probably close to 3/4 of the population who actually identify as being comfortable going back to theaters immediately. That number is steadily on the rise. It was as low as 20-something% early in the year. But as we see this coming out of the spring and into the summer, as more people get out, and I think as more people talk about their experience going back to the movies and seeing movies like A Quiet Place and Cruella, and we'll have Fast 9 coming out in North America here in a few weeks, it will be those kinds of momentum-generating releases that bring people back, and especially as people talk about how safe they feel and how great of a job these theaters have done regarding health, guidelines and practices. And I think we're still in a transition period. The recovery will keep going, but as you mentioned, we don't have all theaters open yet, and we're now seeing a film essentially perform at the level of its predecessor, and that really sets a great expectation for the long-term recovery and even the short-term recovery at this point.
You mentioned Fast 9. It's really interesting how well it's been doing internationally, and yet it's not even here in North America yet. But we did see it drop 80% overall in its second weekend, especially in China. How much of John Cena's comments do you think played a role in all of this, especially the drop that we saw in China?
It's hard to tell specifically. I think historically we also have to look at the fact that most Hollywood releases in China are very front-loaded and tend to experience sharp drops. 60 to 70, sometimes 80% is not entirely unheard of. Also, perhaps word of mouth on the film in that country is something to consider, which isn't always the same market to market. We just kind of will have to see how that plays out in North America, and I think that'll give us a better idea. But yeah, it's something to consider, but I think ultimately China's history for how American films play there, which generally only receive runs of a few weeks at most anyway, it really fits in line with this kind of a drop, just maybe on the higher end of extremes.
Yeah, very good point. And you mentioned Fast 9, Black Widow. We have other Marvel movies also coming out this year. Does this essentially mean summer box office season is back again?
I'm always hesitant to say anything is 100% certain these days. I think right now it feels very much like it is. I think we just have to be careful to not expect it to be 100% like normal. But we do have a summer box office. Summer movie season is here. It wasn't here last year. This performance really tells us that there will be a reliable stream of box office hits this summer. And once we get into the second half of the year, it's really every single weekend almost there's a giant tentpole releasing. So this is the beginning. This is the table setter. We'll have a few more weeks of counter programming movies that come along, maybe don't do quite as much business as A Quiet Place. So it's not expected every week just yet, but we will get there very soon.
Either way, exciting nonetheless. Shawn, such a pleasure to always have you here. Shawn Robbins is the chief analyst over at Boxoffice Pro.